Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode. If you're a mirrorless photographer, you can't have failed to notice how over the past 10 years or so, vintage lens prices have increased a lot. However, there is one group of vintage lenses that seems to have completely bucked that trend as far as I can see. I'm talking about the long zooms, and we're going to look at four of them this week. We've got the 70 to 210mm f4 from Kiron. We've got the 70 to 200mm f3.8 from Vivitar. We've got the Canon FD 70 to 210mm f4, and we've also got the Sirius 70 to 200 f4. I've been shooting these lenses on the full frame Sony A7 and also on the APS-C Fujifilm X-T10, and I've really enjoyed them. If you're looking for a vintage lens for not too much cost, any of these is a great way in, and some of them give really surprising results. Some of these lenses shoot as nicely as any other lens you ever shot, and they're very versatile too. They have a really useful range of focal lengths. 70mm is great for portraiture and general photography. Personally, I like a little bit of reach, the extra reach that 70 gives over 50mm, and at the long end they're really good for things like wildlife, street photography, and anything where you might need a little bit of reach. These lenses really are worthy of consideration. They're very nicely made and engineered, they're optically nice, and really they represent some absolute bargains just at the moment. The usual rules apply when buying a vintage lens, of course. Don't buy a lens with lots of fine scratches, although one or two marks on the glass won't affect image quality at all. Don't buy a lens that's got loads of dust in it, although a tiny bit is acceptable and most vintage lenses will have some dust. And be careful of oil on the aperture blades. A trace is okay, but any more than that and you could find it seeps onto the glass. So without further ado, let's check out our four lovely long zooms. So let's begin with the Vivitar lens, and this lens was lent to me by a work colleague, so many thanks for the loan, Jerry, and this is a surprisingly nice lens. Vivitar were a major manufacturer of lenses in the 70s and the 1980s, but they made very few cameras of their own. I only know of one camera that they made, the V2000, which ran right up until 2005, but they were a very prolific manufacturer of lenses. They made an enormous range of third-party lenses for all the major mounts, and many photographers used these lenses back in the day, and they really represent great bargains. Now, if your budget didn't stretch to a Canon or a Nikon or an Olympus lens, you'd probably have bought one of these as they were a little cheaper, and you'd have got a real bargain as well, because Vivitar lenses are really good quality. Let's have a closer look at this one. It's a very nicely made lens. It's all metal. There are one or two plastic bits like this ring at the end here, but the basic structure, the essential structure, all the barrels and all the internals are metal. All of the markings are painted on, but they do seem to have stood the test of time well. It's a push-pull lens. Many of these older zooms were of the push-pull design, and you can see that we've got the focal lengths marked on this scale here. So push for the wide end 70mm and pull it back to get to 200mm. I guess this method of construction saved a little money, as many lenses were made this way. Many of these long zooms were made this way, and I think it perhaps saved an internal gear or two. It does work well. I've heard no problems with using this kind of lens. If you're buying one though, make sure the push-pull mechanism is tight, because if you want to retract it and you move the lens, hold the lens downwards, if they're loose they can sometimes just fall down like that, which is not ideal, so make sure yours is nice and tight. It's not a fast lens with a maximum aperture of f3.8, but because it's a long lens it will give you plenty of that delicious blur, and delicious really is the word with this lens. It has very, very nice background blur that, generally speaking, doesn't misbehave itself. Pretty much right throughout the range of focal lengths and subject to camera distances, blur remains well behaved with this lens. It's usually very soft and very gentle, and when you get point light sources in the background, they take on very beautiful shapes and give a very beautiful effect. Blur from this lens is really unimpeachable. I couldn't really find much to say wrong about it. It's bound to have one or two harsh spots somewhere. Most vintage lenses do, even the most expensive ones, but this lens, generally speaking, will give you some very nice background blur. It gives nice colour, but I think it's a little flatter than some. Personally, I prefer colours a little bit more pumped up, a little bit more saturated, and I'd say that this lens gives what you might call a naturalistic feel, something more akin to reality. So this is not the most saturated lens in terms of colours. That can easily be changed in post-production, of course. It's a matter of taste, but for me, colour isn't the strongest suit of this lens. Sharpness, however, is quite another story. This is a very sharp lens right throughout its focal length range. Right from 70 to 200, this lens stays sharp, and that was a big surprise to me. I'd expected it to be a little soft. I'd expected it to be a little less than perhaps more premium quality lenses might be, but it was absolutely not the case, and I was very surprised to find this is a sharp lens when shot wide open. This lens has a lovely vintage character. It certainly doesn't look like a modern lens. You can see that in the way it renders, you can see that in the background blur. It's just a lovely lens with a vintage flavour, and it's got as much character as any other vintage lens I've used. So in that regard, this lens is very successful indeed. As regards cost, these lenses are cheap, and I wouldn't expect to pay more than £30 to £40 or so for one of these. You can find them at £20. You can even find them for less than that. And for a lens with great sharpness, a very versatile range of focal lengths, and some very nice background blur and vintage character, I really think that you'd have to go a very long way to beat this lens, and it really is a bargain just at the moment. Next, let's have a look at the Kiron 70 to 210mm f4. I'm not sure if this is a constant aperture lens. Let me have a look. Yes, that is a constant aperture lens, which means that unlike the Sirius here, which, if you notice, is f4 at the wide end and f5.6 maximum aperture at the long end, on this lens, on a constant aperture lens, the aperture stays the same, the maximum aperture stays the same at both the long and the short ends. So you've got f4 at both ends using this lens, and that's a really nice thing. Now, Kiron are well known for having made some very high quality lenses. I have the short zoom in Kiron, what is it now, 28 to 70 is it? Yeah, the 28-70 f2.8, and that's a lovely lens. It's featured in a couple of these episodes, and this one is just as nice, I'm glad to say. Let's have a closer look at this one. So this is another fairly long lens, and it has much the same construction as the other lenses here. It's a push-pull lens. It's got the focal lengths marked on the body. So again, we've got 70 at the push end and 200 at the pull end. It's entirely made of metal, just like the other lenses here today. And generally speaking, this lens, Kiron lenses, have a very high standard of finish. It is quite a physically long lens, same as the Vivitar. It's not quite so compact as the Sirius, but I think the Sirius might have taken a few shortcuts in terms of elements and design in order to get that shorter length. Images from this lens really are quite something. It's got good sharpness, though I'm not sure it beats the Vivitar. I don't think it in fact quite matches the Vivitar for sharpness, but it's still a very sharp lens. It has a very unusual colour palette too, which I've only ever seen on Nikon lenses. It seems to pump up the blues and the greens. Could it be something to do with the glass or the coatings? I'm not sure. It does seem to have some purpley greeny coloration going on there. If you can, I don't know if you can see that, but there's definitely a purpley greeny reddy hue going on there, so it does look like the coatings are responsible for that colour palette. I think possibly the greatest strength of this lens is in its blur characteristics. Blur is lovely, it's well controlled, it's smooth, and it's unflappable. It's actually smoother than the Vivitar, and in certain situations, at certain subject to camera distances, it's so smooth that it does in fact resemble a modern lens in terms of blur, and that really surprised me. I hadn't expected to see that at all. It's not as clinical as a modern lens can be. It does retain some character, but it does have this beautiful soft blur, which is rather nicer than the other three, I think. The Vivitar has very nice blur if you like character. This lens makes blur that is very, very smooth and well controlled. Harsh spots are few and far between, and if you're looking for a vintage lens that gives you nice blur characteristics, well, you could do a great deal worse than one of these. One of the nicest vintage lenses that I've seen for blur, in fact, of all the vintage lenses that I've shot. Just like all the long zooms, vintage long zooms, this one is not terribly expensive. Again, similar to the Vivitar, expect to pay around £30 to £40 for one of these. They are advertised sometimes for more than that, but they're also advertised sometimes for less than that. At £30 to £40, I think this lens is a very significant bargain, and it's a really great way in to shooting vintage lenses. So the next lens for today is this one. This is the Sirius 70 to 210 f4 to f5.6 MC auto zoom, and this is of course another third-party lens, and this one is definitely from the cheaper end of the market. In fact, it's probably not easy to buy a cheaper lens than this one. It's about as cheap as it gets. In its day, this was a bang for your buck lens. There were many lenses like this. They were manufactured under names that you've probably never heard of, and they're usually painted in quite gaudy colours as well. This one's got lots of lime green and red all over it. So be under no illusions, this is a very cheap lens from the bottom end of the market. But is it any good? So there's our little Sirius in all its delightfully coloured splendour. And it's made as nicely as any of the other lenses that we've got on test here today. It's entirely made from metal. The glass is in good condition and there aren't any scratches or any other problems with it. Everything turns cleanly and smoothly and operates just as it's supposed to. And it's another push-pull design, as you can see, and there's more of those gaudily coloured markings there to indicate focal lengths. So this is a nicely made lens, and while it doesn't do any one thing particularly well, it's a reasonably good all-round shooter. It's a fairly sharp lens wide open, and of course if you stop it down it becomes sharper. In fact, it becomes very sharp if you stop it down to 5.6 or f8 or so. But even wide open, it's entirely sharp enough for everyday use. I think it's slightly less sharp than the other lenses in this group, but not by too much. It does lose contrast in direct sunlight, and to a greater extent than some of the other lenses on test today. This one does seem to do it more, and I'm thinking probably the coatings are not quite as good. They don't seem to be multi-coated. Perhaps they are, or maybe they are, but whatever the case, I don't think the coatings are quite as good on this lens as they are on the other lenses that we're looking at. It renders colours nicely. It's got nice warm tones. Saturation is moderate though. I'd prefer colours that are a little bit more pumped up. In fact, quite a lot more pumped up. I do like a bit of saturation in colour. I think it can bring an image to life. But these are nice enough. It's an unpretentious little lens and it delivers competent images, and of course any work that you need to do in post can be done in post. Technically speaking then, this isn't the best lens in the group, but it's more than good enough. It makes nice images, it's versatile, and it has plenty of vintage character. Now there are many of these third-party lenses available, made in the late 70s and the early 80s. As I say, they've got all sorts of names and they're painted all sorts of colours, but as far as I know, they might all have come out of the same factory, and I think quite a bit of that did go on back in the day. If you want a good one, between £10 and £20, and you stand a good chance of finding one of these lenses for less than £10. So really, for a competent lens that gets very sharp when you stop it down, I think that's a bargain too. Here's another 70 to 210 f4, and I think this one is another constant aperture. Yes, it is. So on this lens as well, you get maximum aperture of f4 at both the wide and the long ends. It's from the FD series of lenses, which were a very successful range of lenses, and a really high quality range of lenses as well in terms of the images that they can make. It was their penultimate series of film lenses, so they benefit from modern designs, modern coatings, and so forth. I've tried a few of these Canon FD lenses and they are absolutely beautiful. The 1.450mm is one of the nicest 1.450s I've ever shot. It really is lovely, and the 1.850 is really nice as well. So I was expecting some nice images from this one. Let's have a closer look at it before we go into that. Like all of these lenses, this is a big push-pull lens, and it has the usual markings for focal lengths on the barrel here. So the wide end 70mm is right at the front there. Push as far as you can and pull back, same as the other lenses, to achieve the 200mm focal length at the long end. Unlike the others, this may not be entirely metal. There is a lot of metal used in its construction, and I'm pretty sure it's almost all metal. In fact, all of the external barrels are metal, and I'm sure all of the internal engineering bits are metal too, but Canon did use a little bit of plastic on the FD lenses. I'm trying to find exactly where it is on this one. Maybe they didn't use any on this one. I'm not sure, but whatever the case, it's a good, solid, substantial lens, and it certainly works well enough. Image quality from this lens really is quite something. In fact, it's more than quite something. Images from this lens, given the type of lens it is, are nothing short of outstanding. I was absolutely astonished to see the quality of images that this lens can make. Canon lenses have long been known for their quality of their images, and this one certainly doesn't let the side down. It's a very, very sharp lens. I was blown away by how sharp this lens is. Wide open, stop down. It's very sharp right across the range. It doesn't really matter. It is slightly less sharp wide open, but not enough that you'd notice. It really is that good a lens. Absolutely astonishing sharpness. Very, very surprising in a lens this cheap. It's also got really fantastic colours. They're pumped up, saturated, just beautiful. Again, Canon have long been known for their outstanding colour science, and they've certainly managed to pull it off with this lens, as indeed they did with the rest of the FD lens range. They were very, very well known for the kind of colours that they would deliver. This one is stunning for colours, easily, far and away, the nicest in the group. The Kiron lens has saturated colours too, but they're a little unconventional. These are more conventional colours. This lens gives colours a warm sort of feel. It's a warm lens rather than a cool one, which again is just right for my personal taste. And by and large, I think this is the nicest lens for colour here, although of course it is a matter of personal taste. Sharpness is outstanding. It's certainly the sharpest lens in the group. It beats the Sirius lens by a long way. It beats the Kiron, and I think it just beats the Vivitar as well. There's not much in it, but I do think this Canon is sharper than the Vivitar. In terms of cost, again, it's pretty cheap. 30 to 40 pounds should bag you a nice one of these, and you could well find one for less. But I think 30 to 40 pounds for a lens that's this good and this versatile can only be money well spent. So these are all nice lenses in their own way. Their performance is similar. The differences are really differences in detail. I think the Canon takes the crown for sharpness, although the Vivitar is a very close second. I think the Canon also takes the crown for colour, although obviously colour is subjective. And for me, the Kiron is a very close second. So my order of preference is Canon, Kiron, Vivitar, with the Sirius bringing up the rear. As a very much cheaper lens, the Sirius just can't quite cut it with these slightly more expensive optics. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to help it grow and develop and to support it, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.